Right, so hello everyone and welcome to this week's installment of Zgodovina, Špici, or History of the Edge. Today we have the pleasure of listening to a lecture from Željka Oparnica, who is one of our current visiting fellows here at the Institute of Contemporary History. At the moment, Željka is working as a research fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade. In recent times, she has also worked as a fellow at the British School in Rome, as well as at the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London. She received her PhD in history from Birkbeck College at the University of London, where she defended a thesis on the politics of Sephardi Jewish communities in the Balkans during the first half of the 20th century. Currently, Željka is working on a somewhat different, albeit very much related topic, and these are the experiences of political minorities that operated outside the inter-war Yugoslav states' increasingly narrow system of parliamentary politics. Today, we have the privilege of hearing an in-depth lecture on one of those groups, and that is the inter-war Yugoslav student movement. And that will be all from my side for now. So, Željka, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Oliver, for a very generous presentation, introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will start with the PowerPoint that I will move to watch myself. First of all, I have to say that it's a honor, but also it's a difficult moment to talk about student movement just 3 days before the first anniversary of the fall of the canopy at the train station in Novi Sad. It killed 16 people and also started an unprecedented wave of student protests and rebellions in Europe. What is today contemporary Serbia under huge political repression. This topic, this contemporary situation looms over my research in a way that's very obvious to me, and I will try to explain how it actually shapes or how it is connected to what am I going to talk today about. So basically, once the protests in Serbia started with student strikes and occupations of university buildings, it was very fascinating to see how quickly it spread, the span of it, basically the organization behind it. And of course, at first we were wondering how is it possible, but of course social networks really offered a way of interpreting and understanding this new generation. So in the context of repression and the high significance of political space that we can occupy, in which we can work, social networks provided a version of political background for contemporary situation. But what was the case, or how could you spread the message? How could you engage students in the situation of inter-war Yugoslavia, where political oppression was again significant, where you could get arrested or banned from the city for your political occupation, and how could you basically spread the movement? So this is the major question relating to my topic today, but this is also something that I want to explore more in comparative study within what I call political minorities in inter-war Yugoslavia. I see political minorities as groups organized around mutual interest called questions and topics that lie beyond the parliamentary system and functions of parliamentary parties in this period. And beyond the student movement, I also trying to historicize how political mobilization happened in trade unions, among refugees, and among Italian redemptists. So the topic of this, or the title of this lecture, refers directly to Hobsbawm's remark in his memoirs about how the remark was basically that the student movement in interwar Yugoslavia, and especially at the University of Belgrade, was an exception to general passivity of European youth of that age. And this is a remark that all the people who work on interwar Yugoslavia often use and often debate with. But I think it really has some, it gives a good background, or it gives us reasons to ask why was this movement so successful, and to even question whether it was successful. So don't be scared with this very textual PowerPoint slide. This is just a summary of all the things that I won't go very deeply into, just because the student movement itself and all the events that happened were very, went in greater, you could talk about it in greater details. I just want to say that I will talk about this formative, what I call the formative period between 1929 and 1936, where the main ideas of politics, or of the ways of the reasons and the goals of student movement shape. And I'm very interested in the longevity of this of these issues. My colleague wrote a very extremely interesting book on the period that comes right after this, so basically 1937, 1968. That is Jelena Latovic's wonderful book on the press, student press, that basically shaped political views of the student movement in this very long period of time. But in this period from 1936 until 1968 or until 1941, a lot of things, all the big successes basically stem from the period that I will talk about in a bit more detail. So I will face you with what are my theses for this talk. So first of all, I see that Yugoslav youth was shaped by the experience of everyday repression they faced in their communities, and for this reason they revived an anti-imperial form of resistance that existed mostly before the First World War. This resistance took shape in informal reading circles and informal literary groups, which they filled now with new socially conscious and anti-nationalist content. My second thesis is that this was actually very unique potential and ability of the Yugoslav youth to develop ideas and practices that fostered solidarity between classes, nations, and ethnic groups, and between gender. That actually prefigured the Popular Front before its official articulation in 1935, and even left-wing convergences in Western Europe that started in 1932. And third is that this movement basically happened parallel to Communist Party of Yugoslavia. This is not, my idea is not to diminish or negate the role of Communist Party, but the idea is to offer a complementary social and cultural history of the student movement, and maybe even interwar politics in general. So I will first talk a bit about the problems that exist in literature opens up for us, and where I see that I can contribute. Also about my sources, and then basically delve into examples that I find actually shape this period. So those are individuals, literary circles, and the literature that shaped this generation. So the literature of this year is actually abundant, but and deals about the topic of the mobilization of youth, but it basically goes in two strands that I don't find really answer this question in unsatisfactory with why was it mobilized in ways in which it was mobilized. I think on the one hand we have a very general social, economic situation that shaped the youth, or like historians really emphasize with full right the fact that the economic crisis brought the very high rate of unemployment, that the social mobility was practically impossible, that political oppression really left narrow space to engage in politics. Thus, you had to find alternative ways, which were all reasons that stand. But my idea is basically to go back and focus on the individuals, or basically on the actors of that era. And the second part of literature gives the Communist Party of Yugoslavia all seeing and all acting possibilities. I honestly, sometimes when I read this literature, I imagine the Communist Party is like an organism very similar to one of my favorite cartoon characters, Krang from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that kind of tries and manages to extend to organize everything but fails in the end. This is why I think there are reasons to question this narrative, not from the stance of negating its role, but only contextualizing it closer. I think the sources from the Communist Party's Central Committee really give us good reasons to contextualize youth mobilization in a different way. First of all, the context of the party in this period from 1929 is actually the Great Purge, both in communist youth and in the party. So first of all, of course, the Communist Party was banned in 1921, and all of its actions were illegal from that point on. The purge in the communist youth and the party between 1929 and 1931 basically desiccated membership to the extent that in 1929 there were only 14 members of communist youth at the University of Belgrade. The reports of the party in 1932 completely don't give any attention to the student protests that started actively in 1931 and don't engage with them. We see that regional party committees of Croatia and Slovenia in 1934 suggest stronger connections with communist youth and basically trying to gain better influence, or to establish roots in the student movement. But what I found very actually crucial in this whole in this whole system of reports is one special report that states that in 1933, when the party sent out official materials, leaflets, and brochures, out of 84, only 60 reached its destination, and all of the 60 were in Slovenia, while nothing reached Moravska province and Vardarska province, so basically today Central Serbia and Macedonia. So we can really talk about basically how and whether a lot of this material and thus a lot of ideas really reach a majority of even interested population, not to talk about someone who should get interested. So now a topic that I really love to talk about is memoirs, and memoirs from this generation of political actors. Here I basically pictured three of possibly my favorites, which are Hobsbawm, Mitrović, and Milo Angelis. But what I was fascinated by is the fact that my estimate is tens of thousands of different types of memoirs from this era. Some of them are published in the way that you can see here as memoirs or autobiographies. A lot of them, or they're published as memories that were printed or published for an occasion of remembering certain anniversary of either student movement or party or or the war, but a lot of them are collected and what I call institutionalized through different initiatives of different institutions that were interested in this era. For instance, at the City Archive of Belgrade, my estimate, informed estimate, is around 6,000 memoirs by those who participated in the student movement at the University of Belgrade. And these kind of collections exist in all former republics. So the idea is not to say, wow, there are so many memoirs, that's the reason to use them, but this quantity really gives us like some kind of perspective, or gives us like basis of comparison, which I think is very useful when we talk about like actors. We can deduct names, locations, book titles, all things that are relevant. And of course, this is not also to say that memoirs should be taken for granted. They are personal accounts that aim to mediate personal experience with general experience, but still there are, I think, good reasons to use them. And if you want, I can go back to this topic later on. So I just want to give like a state of affairs, since I'm focusing on the aspect of students and youth in education system. This is a very, I think there are facts that we need to establish in order to build a story on. First of all, famously, literacy in the entire Yugoslav kingdom was 51.5%. This, of course, was very dependent on where you were at that moment. Famously, Dejansko province, or what is today Slovenia, had over 99% of literacy, but this number basically dropped further south we went. So in Zgodovina province, in Predavala province, the literacy rate was under 40%, which really shaped the way the education and basically the political reasons to join the movement. Also, what is interesting is that this is relevant for me as I'm focusing on the University of Belgrade, but I'm interested in comparative cases as well, that most of the students to Belgrade were from Moravska Banovina, Moravska province, today's central Serbia, which had literacy rate around 50%, and Zgodovina province, which was around also that. So basically, the idea of progressive education had to be built up. The state did something. It basically did build this state of the basics of the public school system that we have today, based on the obligatory 8 years education system. But this also happened in a very strong repression among teachers who were seen as potential outliers to the system. And after a lot of teachers basically participated in the first forms of the Communist Party from 1921, and they were really strictly controlled throughout the period until the Second World War, based on these activities. So I found a file at the Archive of Yugoslavia that basically collected reports from every school in Serbia, in which there were teachers who were members or were on a list or election list for Communist Party. And this Ratko Penezic is definitely my idol for taking this opportunity to kind of make a legitimate joke on the fact that you can't belong to an organization that does not exist. But the idea is that the pressure on individual was strong. Coming to basically this personal aspect of this history, a lot of writers of these memoirs and activists really referred to personal influence in their political choices. So what was really interesting for me is that even in smallest villages like Sjenica, where Gojko Nikolić was from, or Podgradu, where a village next to a very small town, Cetinje, where Svetozar Vukomanović temple was from, people were politically engaged and belonged to parties. Vojko Nikolić's brother was a member of Serbian Democratic Party, which was Privićević, like the Serbian minority in Croatia party. But this did not influence Vojko to follow his brother's steps. The same can be said about Hobsbawm and his uncle, who was a member of Yugoslav Muslim organization, but who did not follow his uncle's steps. And basically this entire generation rejected this idea of nation-based politics that was built, like structuralized in the interwar party organization. Of general parliamentary parties are active in that time, but rather they followed different paths. Hobsbawm really referenced in, I think, five times referenced Vojko Vuković, who was a cobbler, who belonged to the party, like first the Social Democratic Party during the imperial or Habsburg era in Bosnia, and afterwards was a member of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and even a member of the Central Committee. His entire family was involved, and they all died during the Second World War, including his wife, daughter, and 3 sons on the side of partisans in Bosnia, or Herzegovina in this case. But also teachers who were rebellious, who were still non-conforming with this very repressive school politics, were very well remembered. Among them was Oskar Davičo, who taught also in Mostar Grammar School, who was a professor of French and always adapted his lectures to bring out certain social politics. He was also involved in student societies that I will reference a bit later. And Aki Šeremet, who was famously arrested alongside with his students at the grammar school in Gospić in 1928. So basically, the strongest influence that you could get in that era was from your teachers, if you had any personal interest. What I'm particularly interested about, and something that really sparked my imagination, are literary circles that were developed in this era. I think the literary circles developed in this era basically were a sign that school does not answer curiosity of the new generation nor their political preferences. And what I'm interested in building on is that literary circles in this era were building on existing tradition and structure. So basically, in the period before the First World War, literary circles really were focused on national emancipation against imperial world order and imperial oppression. And now in interwar Yugoslavia, that is supposed to be like a new inclusive country of all its citizens and all its youth. Now the youth was basically using this form to fight their new battle. My idea is that they basically filled this content with rejection. They had new content to offer within literary circles, which was the rejection of national and nation-based politics. First of all, what was very in the male grammar school, real grammar school in Mostar, where Hobsbawm formed his first literary circle. The members of it were were mixed. So basically, there were Serbs, Croatians, and Muslims, which was a very rare occasion in this very mixed setting to have members of all groups together, especially after the murder of Stjepan Radić, where this really mobilized Croatian nationalism, and on the other hand, a lot of Serbs who participated in the official state in politics of integral Yugoslavism, which was also very nationalist. Avdo Kumo, who belonged to this literary circle in Mostar, also belonged to another one after he got kicked out of his Mostar school. He formed another one only 2 years later in Bihać. So basically, there was this was the idea of continuous participation in what's going on in Belgrade, which was a capital and of course like a very different situation. But what I find very interesting and like connecting to my previous research is the participation of Jews in these circles. I think this is the first time the Jews basically participate in social organizations of youth. And also what I really find explicit for this period is basically the participation of women, both in Mostar, in Belgrade, and especially in the fourth female gymnasium or grammar school, where Stefania Vrcel really referenced the extreme enthusiasm of her friends who were Jews, Luna and Ida Cohen, but especially Belina Graziani, who got arrested as an activist when she was 13 years old. The content of the generation is basically literature. Quite famous, but still quite interesting aspects of literature were brought up in these literary circles. First of all, a lot of memoirs that I read reference Maxim Gorky as probably the biggest influence, especially his novel Mother. But they also read French realism like Balzac or Zola, and one, if they could get a hand on literature that was basically based on that was from like any member, like any official communist literature, like Philip Philipp with the development of society and the key of history of materialism. That was a reason to celebrate. In Mostar, they divided Philip Philipp's book in 3 parts so that they could read it in parallel and basically exchange ideas while they were all reading it. And this tells us a lot about the accessibility of books, or actually lack of it, and thus also the lack of information and circulation of ideas. In the same period, even if you went to National Library in Belgrade, you had to get up very early in order to get any kind of progressive literature, such as Rosa Luxemburg's letters or texts, because there was a scarce amount of them, and if you would get them, you had to be there very early to be the first one to read them. But this all changed with Nolit, or publishing house, Nova Literatura, New Literature, that was the first one that printed literature that was really of interest of this new generation. To the extent that Avdo Kumo remembered that like all of his literary group would already at the age of 15 would collect money in order to buy new editions of the book. And Mitra Mitrovic remembers that as a 16-year-old, she remembers the moment when she held the magazine New Literature in her hands. So this was something that really like shaped the fact that you could get to books, really shaped the discourse. What I also think was very interesting is that in this communal reading, as other like basically people who are more working on theoretical aspects of communal reading, state that the communal reading does not offer unlimited interpretations of text, but they have to resonate with the entire group. There is a consensus of an idea, and also that the consensus is basically based on the relationship of the group. So basically, as long as the group exists, the idea exists, which is a very powerful tool in the hands of youth of that year. The fact that they read what is called like Belle is not only should not be taken as only pastime. These books were basically like information that they were gaining information from these books. Especially Gorky was a like solid base for understanding how conspirative work functions and what it is, and also both he also gave good insights on the destiny of revolutionaries after the October Revolution. Edwin Kish, with his book Paradise America, really shaped the idea of how class divisions look like in the States, and many of them referenced how these ideas really shaped how they looked, how they saw the contemporary world around them. They also read Sinclair and Jack London, the social literature. But what was really interesting that neither Gorky or Babel, who they read with a lot of interest, did not really offer information about how the new socialist society looked. So there was a lot of space for imagination and like basically political debate, which also fostered the group and its dedication to the social cause. And like this very close relationship with literature they shared basically was something that Mitra is really well defined as physiognomy of the entire generation. So basically that's the fact that they were shaped by similar and same literature kind of gave them this feeling that they were like mutually understanding each other, which really helped shape further connections once they went to university or once they joined the party. So I will just offer some general conclusions and offer some questions that I'm thinking about and how I would like to frame my research around this topic. So I believe that the student movement really gives us good reasons to think about how informal politics functioned on an everyday level and what was it based on. I'm a very big fan of this long-term thinking about institutions or forms of mobilization. So in my way, I think this literary circle is an interesting aspect because it combines this long history of anti-imperial struggle but also changing its context in a very innovative way for the society. I also believe that the fact that I was talking a bit about Belgrade, but mostly about other places that are not so central in European history or urban in general. I feel that this exchange and basically connection between rural and urban youth really broadened the perspective of the student movement and basically really shaped the social peasant revolution in the Second World War. On the other hand, I'm very interested in the ways in which these kind of similar or the same forms of resistance existed elsewhere. Of course, there is a lot written about 40s in the Caribbean or late 30s in India and anti-colonial struggle. But it would be really interesting I would love to build very good parallels in helping me to study this on or contribute to the Yugoslav example on a broader level. And I do, so far I have worked mostly on the memoirs based that are focused on Belgrade, that did gain a lot of students from the very mixed backgrounds, but this was not the case, for instance, in Zagreb, the University of Zagreb, the University of Ljubljana. So I would love input or suggestions of how do you look this kind of basically mixing or what would be different outcomes in these settings. And yes, for the end, I would really love to thank everyone at the Institute for a very, very warm and welcoming atmosphere to work. And it was really a pleasure to meet you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Željka, for the wonderful lecture. And now
Keeping
questions.
For being in town.
Absolutely. So, questions. Yes.
So would you say that the fact that they were reading the same literature that was available gave them like the strength to have the same values?
I mean,
As
yeah.
as like a movement?
Well, the same values is, I think that's a very like strong thing, but I think there was definitely like there were values in which they definitely agreed on. For instance, that they didn't like the state of the affairs in the country, or like how like the social like system worked, or how it preferred certain groups. So that was definitely established in those groups. It's interesting to like look at like how I like for like a broader topic, I would also refer to like how they all felt that they were communists through already in these groups, not all, a lot of them, but then only once they entered like university and started reading a bit more, like getting acquainted with like people who actually knew something about Marxism, they realized that whatever they thought beforehand was not really like in line with what is the like official party line, or what is really Marxist, but still this is like there was a line of thinking that connected all of it in a way through it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. I was curious if the students were from a particular faculty or discipline, or is it just overall, is it more lawyers or engineers or?
Yeah. There were definitely more and less prominent faculties in the struggle. So the faculty for Yugoslav literature was very prominent, and this really resonates with literature. But also there were different ways of distinguishing yourself as a revolutionary, even at the Faculty of Medicine, that had a very interesting seminary for social medicine that was very progressive looking. University, like Faculty of Law, was there was like a very tense situation, because like half of the students at the University of Belgrade were actually students at University of the Faculty of Law, and for like the strongest like battle to gain membership was at the Faculty of Law. So a lot of prominent members of the movement really invested a lot of their efforts to gain basically gain popularity, or to gain support for the Faculty of Law. So there were differences, but they were not always like, I don't know, like humanities versus like hard sciences, but they were quite mixed, which I find very interesting. And even for those who were in like hard sciences, they did still refer to a similar basis of shared ideas of the world that like came from literature or like social circles.
Well, if I may pose a question. So you mentioned 1929 as the beginning of this time frame which you're looking at. Would you say that like the dictatorship itself was the primary catalyst for this form of organization, or were the 1920s generally characterized by a different dynamic when it comes to student organization, and that then led to some kind of pronounced qualitative shift, like in the 1930s, which you mostly focus on?
Well, definitely the dictatorship influenced a lot, or like really brought the tensions to a high point. But I mean, I think it was just like a pinnacle of really longer dissatisfaction. So yeah, I would say that there has been like a lot of influences. The first like movement, the first significant protest in this era that I'm referring to was against dictatorship, or this like fake government that the state produced in order to to kind of showcase the idea of parliament. And students reacted, so this there was a strong outburst in there. But there were, like, slowly it was really established that there are also a lot of social causes that were of interest. And this especially was brought forward through the mediation between Belgrade and Zagreb and Ljubljana, where the question of enrollment fees became crucial. The question of the students at the University of Ljubljana who studied medicine could only take, I think, 3 out of 5 years in Ljubljana, so they had to move after 3 years. That was really something that mobilized people. So basically, this, like, the social aspects of the student movement built on the dissatisfaction with the dictatorship, but dictatorship did play some, like, role in forming.
So,
I really loved the whole lecture, and I have 3 questions, or just thoughts that I had. The first is about the Communist Party, and I really liked in the beginning how you said that it's not just the Communist Party, but it's much broader. So, and I completely agree with you, and I think this from below perspective makes a lot of sense and can help us understand better these developments in the 30s with the Popular Front, before Popular Front, etc. And I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about how you see the whole, like, student movement in the second half of the 1930s in relation to the party. If there's something more that you'd like to add. Second is about these memoirs that you mentioned in the archives that are about 6,000, which is really huge number. I don't know, I mean, I'm wondering how far are you with the research, and if you can say something about, like, what would be some differences between these published memoirs, such as the one of recently published Mitras, but then the other ones that have been published for some time, and those in the archives, like, and if you can say something more about those in the archives. And the third, if you can maybe come back to the beginning of your lecture and say something about how you see the relationship with today's student movement and I mean, generally the differences or comparisons that you would think about in terms of ideology or in terms of reasons for why the student movement today started, and, like, how do you see the connection?
Thank you, all wonderful questions. So first, relationship between the Communist Party and the student movement in the late 30s. Based on what I saw in research is basically after 1933, but especially 1934, there is, like, a greater involvement of the Communist Party, and the membership of both communist youth and party members grows, which definitely shapes the movement. But I would say that, like, at least until 1936, we can't talk about, like, any like final or, like, definite influence of the party on the movement.
Why 36?
1936.
Why then?
I think 1936 was a very, like, big turn, because after the basically murder of Žarko Marinović and the shaping of I think the 1936 really shaped the project, or, like, the program of the student movement that was really turned towards this defense of the autonomy of university and anti-fascist, which also meant anti-fascism within the state and outwards. And that was really the influence, like, the ways in which it was shaped was definitely based on the, like, corresponding bodies, both in Comintern but also on the Europe-wide level. And I would actually love to hear what you think about it, but this is how, like, my imagination. When it comes to memoirs in the archives, I haven't read 6,000, I think I read 150, to be honest. Yes, maybe more, I haven't counted, I should. I think they're very different to the published ones that basically establish a very broad introduction of, like, how the world functioned, or how the writers would function or how they saw the world, basically from childhood until their later age or mature age. And the memoirs in the archives are really specific and deal with certain periods and are really focused on like extrapolating facts, where they met, who was there. So basically since they were based on since they were asked to produce memoirs based on their participation in certain action or certain part of the movement, they really tried to give facts, and most of them you could see had zero to non-literary interest or interest to shape to give their perspective on how good or bad was the party, which is something that really differs with parties. What I really find interesting actually in the published memoirs is the extent to which those who became party members, most in 1933 and 1934, like Mitra, but also Tempo, they do refer to Mitra not, but Nikolic and Tempo do refer to their dissatisfaction of how the party functioned and how it was organized, and they actually prefer the ways in which they were learning outside of the party or in these literary close reading circles than in how the knowledge was spread within party cells. So this is something that I think they had this liberty of talking about the party before 1938, and because this was the definitive moment when Tito became the general secretary, and basically this year really kind of shaped the rest of their ideas of the party and general ideas. But in this first period, I feel they were quite they allowed themselves to express their dissatisfaction or something. So I think this is also interesting when we talk about memoirs. And I think because the memoirs in the archives are really filled with names, I think it at some point would be really interesting. I mean, I think we could really count the members of the party, which would really compared with the numbers of students would really give us really good outlook on how the party would function. And the third and the hardest question, well, I think it's not coincidence that I also referred to the beginning of the student movement in Serbia with the reel, as the youth would say. I showed it at the beginning of the talk. I think the student movement in Serbia is also informative phase, in the sense that it has started the battle against dictatorship or dissatisfaction with how politics function, but they also I have some contact with people, with students who are involved in certain aspects that work with unions and the student movement, and I feel there's a stronger impetus to really engage with everyday people's struggles. So I think the movement is also still kind of gathering input from broader population, which I think is a good thing. Yeah, I see this definitely as a beginning. I think it's so the battle at the University of Belgrade, depending on whom you ask, lasted for 20 years, so don't give up. That's the message.
Can you tell us a bit more about this communist ideology before the Communist Party? Because you said that there was clear ideological conflict or non-alignment, let's say. Did this come? How does this come across? So is it formulated retrospectively by looking at the conflicts at the time, or was there already an actual coalesced ideology that you could identify? What were its elements? How did it differ? And finally, does it ever come back? So I imagine that the Communist Party has a kind of totalizing effect eventually. And is there ever a return to this kind of pre-party line? so, in what ways?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, and it's something that I really would love to have like a definite answer, which I don't. I wouldn't call it a pre-communist ideology, nor I would call it ideology. There was like this social awareness and awareness. There was this interest in communism that they couldn't figure out what it was. I think Tempo, at some point in his memoir, says like, I refer to myself as communist, but I really had no idea what it actually was. And even Gojko Nikolić referred like, oh, we were vulgar materialists for this period of his student era. So there is this basically, I think maybe even general rebellion against the state of society, and especially like social aspects of the struggle, but not really a definitive. I think there was also this like fascination of like the revolution in Russia. So basically, this kind of the combination of like the fascination and gave some kind of, but no one really refers to it. No one really describes it very closely. We can only build it on what's like, or I'm trying to build it based on what they referenced as their like biggest influences, which is basically some of the works of literature that I referenced, and also the direct like personal influences.
And just the shortest follow-up, do they also write literature themselves?
To an extent, yes. I mean, a lot of them do write. So Zero does write, and like a lot of them also become very active, like as journalists in this period after 36, or actually 37, when there is a press, like official press, student press. But of course, beforehand they publish like their short stories and so on. But there is also like. There was a way of even writing about politics in this era. So yeah, Gojko Nikolić wrote his like essay on the state of social medicine in Belgrade that is preserved, and he actually he had a copy and he wrote his memoirs. So basically, there is this idea that they did produce even some like political texts that are very interesting to look at and see where they were coming from. But their biggest influences, if they could get to read like Filipović, who was one of the biggest communist intellectuals of the era, they were definitely influenced by it.
If I may have like another, when it comes to the scope of research, do you intend to limit yourself to university students, or also like to basically high school pupils? Because you mentioned these literary circles, and also in many of these case study areas like Bosnia, for example, I guess the high schools are really the main setting ground for this kind of activism and literary activity. And I guess that would be very interesting to trace through a wider time scope, because
yeah, definitely. I'm sorry if it didn't come through. Like, very interested in what was happening before the university, because at the university, once you were all together, it's like it was fairly easy to join a group. But like when you were outside of the place where everything was happening, it was quite difficult. So yeah, I'm interested in what got them interested in politics before they went, and most of them have a story, like or refer to something that was inspiring for them in different ways. So yeah.
do we have any Zoom questions?
There's
Another question.
Okay, sorry.
I don't know, I think I remember correctly, but you said some Jewish activist was captured when she was shooting. How did that happen?
She was officially like in high school back then, and they had she and her group participated in protests, and basically it was like case of police brutality. Which what is very interesting, there are like she also left her memoirs, but she doesn't talk about it a lot. But all of her friends talk about it, because they were also expelled from their school because of the participation. and that really influenced them as like the drop that really filled the glass. What is really interesting, I think, when it comes to Jewish participation is that how they shifted from a very like nation-centric activism to basically this general inclusive activism in this period. And I think this was like, if for anything else, this is like one of the biggest successes of the student movement in the ways in which like this shift could happen and never happened before, like literally never happened before. So yeah, I mean, in this part of the world.
Any more questions?
Yes.
How much was the national question something that the student movements were talking about? Because when I was working a bit to and the student movement, these nationalist groups were very important, and then carrying some of the students towards the Communist Party further on.
Yes.
Defend the same.
A very good book will be published on this topic by our very dear friend and colleague Stefan Kužvica, who will talk about it, of course. But it was a question. I mean, what I feel from the memoirs, and I think it kind of comes up in the political text of the era, is that there was not really a direct answer to the pressure of nationalism, in the sense that like, oh yes, we are now an inclusive, very forward-thinking, progressive group, but there was just this like going against the very repressive nationalistic politics. So this is like what I can say for now, but not really very elaborate. And of course, like there were respect between like Croatian, Slovenian, Serb groups, or like the general groups, or even like Muslims and Jews, but it wasn't like, I don't think it was really public. There wasn't really a program around it.
Well, if there's no more questions, then Željka, thank you so much again for the excellent lecture. And just as a quick note for our listeners, the next History on the Edge will take place on 12th of November at 11 a.m., not at 3. And it's going to be a presentation of the book, A History of Macedonian Sociology, in Quest for Identity, by our soon-to-be visiting fellow and colleague Naum Trajanovski. Have a nice day and see you soon.
Thank you.